Okay.
Welcome everyone who is watching us. Today we welcome Professor Jonathan Pugh from Newcastle University, one of the most important theorists on insularity. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in ancient history at the Laboratory for the Study of the Roman Empire and the Ancient Mediterranean at the University of São Paulo, where I'm undertaking research on the foundations of ancient Greek cities on islands along the coast of Croatia. As part of my studies on Croatian islands, I and my colleague Erika Anglicke from the University of London, a specialist on the Cyclades Islands in Greece, will be launching by December this year a dossier on the topic of island studies of insularity in the ancient Mediterranean by the journal Mare Nostrum, a publication of the Laboratory for the Studies on the Roman Empire and Ancient Mediterranean at the University of São Paulo. This interview with Professor Pugh will be published in written form in this dossier. We are also with our colleague Gabriel Cabral, PhD student in ancient history at the University of São Paulo, who is helping us on the technical part and will collect questions in the chat for Professor Pugh to answer at the end. So please, Erika.
Good night, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all you, and particularly speaking about islands, which is my favorite topic. And today we will have Jonathan Pugh, who is a reader in island studies at the Department of Geography at Newcastle University. John has more than 70 publications on various topics on island studies. He has held a number of visiting fellowships, given international keynote addresses, and has been invited to multiple places like Princeton, Harvard, Virginia Tech, London, Cornell, Vienna, Zurich, Dublin, California University, Western, and Taiwan University. Jonathan's present work examines how work with islands is playing in a increasing prominent role in the generation of wider approaches to critical thinking. And we brought John here in order that he will explain a little bit of his theories, of his books, and I hope that you enjoy our interview, our discussion, and above all, I hope that you can think about your own islands and also about the questions linked with the Anthropocene. And yes, that is, John, the floor is yours. So you can start to explain to us what is the Anthropocene.
Okay, so first of all, you can still hear me, yeah?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
It's great to talk to you, Lillian and Erica. You were talking about islands being your favourite subject, Erica. And what's so great about islands and island scholarship is people from all these different backgrounds get to chat. So I know nothing about island archaeology and Greek Mediterranean work and Croatia. So what I'm really hoping is that I can learn as much from you as you can learn from some of the more contemporary work that I'm doing. So that is what I do. I do contemporary work on islands. So I look at how islands are thought about today, how they become generative for more broader critical trends in thought. And as Erica just said, my kind of work I've been doing over the last 5 years or so has been on islands in the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene, it's interesting. I trying to get into archaeology. I just printed off a paper today that's just come out from Scott Fitzpatrick and Christiana Giovas, which is on tropical islands in the Anthropocene. So obviously, to a greater or less extent, island scholars that work in archaeology are engaging the Anthropocene. But I understand that's a kind of growing field, whereas in kind of contemporary social sciences and humanities, the Anthropocene is a huge field. And as I say, my work is on islands in the Anthropocene. And what I do in my latest book, which I've written with David Chandler from University of Westminster, is I make the argument that islands are absolutely crucial for the Anthropocene. And I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But what
Joe, can I just one part, because you thought that you work with contemporary island. Just a curiosity, do you work only with inhabited islands? Because, for example, the island where I excavated the Spotico, we don't have inhabitants. There are nobody living in the island since 200 years. There's just the ancient sanctuary. So, do we also deal with?
I mean, so in terms of my own work, well, my background's quite long, so I've done lots of different types of work. I'm getting a bit older now, and I guess my initial background was in the Caribbean, so I did a lot of work. Obviously, most of those islands, a lot of the islands are like Barbados and St. Lucia are inhabited. But in terms of my work on islands and the Anthropocene, I'm much more interested in how islands or islandness is kind of being thought to help generate understanding about the Anthropocene. And that dovetails into your question, which is, what is the Anthropocene? So obviously for a lot of people, the Anthropocene means a new epoch potentially in history, which is characterized by climate change, global warming, intensified hurricanes, ocean acidification, indigenous people losing their islands sinking under rising sea levels, continued colonial exploitation, and so on. So the Anthropocene is this kind of profound shift, which is for many is demanding the name of a new geological epoch from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, because humans have messed up so badly that they've transformed planetary conditions that we now have a new geological epoch. But for me and my work on the Anthropocene, I think of the Anthropocene as much more about a shift in mindset. And the key thing that's changing is we don't like modern reasoning anymore, modern frameworks of reasoning. So the mode of reasoning that splits the world into the modern frameworks of a human nature divide, a mind-body divide, the idea that humans can command and control nature is clearly under attack. Yeah, it's going to be under attack, because if humans have screwed up the planet, then those modern frameworks of reasoning that many suggest led to that are going to be under attack. Now, that leads to, well, what tropes rise to the surface once the older frameworks of modern reasoning, humans above nature, come under attack. And the dominant trope of Anthropocene thinking that I kind of engage, but I think it is the dominant trope of Anthropocene thinking more generally, is that of relational entanglements. So how humans are relationally entangled with non-humans, because that's what we're interested in, the relational complexities and entanglements. Now, why would islands matter to this? Well, in the past, islands have always been thought of, in a sense, to do with relational entanglements. But in the past, under modern or colonial frameworks of reasoning, that was their weakness. They were relationally entangled with nature. They were too reliant on nature, that kind of thing. And everything was relationally entangled on islands. And so the modern or colonial thinker just wanted to rise above that and control nature. So they weren't interested in islands. But in the Anthropocene, when relational entanglement becomes a dominant concern, how are humans entangled with the non-human world, it would be inevitable that Anthropocene scholars, scientists, humanities, social scientists interested in this would want to take an interest in geographies and geographical forms that enable them to think relationally, to think about relational entanglements. So that's what my more recent work has been doing. It's been looking at why these very peripheral figures under modernity, these tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific or the Maldives, the Caribbean, wherever, Arctic or whatever, these were isolated in modern reasoning or colonial reasoning because it was about rising above relational entanglements or controlling them. They're on the periphery, the liminal figures of modern thought. But in the Anthropocene, these islands rise to the center, not just because they're the most interesting or powerful symbols of global warming. Yeah, obviously the Maldives and places like that and the Caribbean intensified hurricanes, they're symbolic of how humans are messing up the planet. Not just because of that, but because we are interested in developing relational ways of thinking and being and knowing, because we don't like modernity anymore. Modernity and the modern frameworks of reasoning screwed everything up. So we're interested in more relational, non-modern ways of thinking. So islands and islanders, once on the periphery, shift much more centrally to debate. And that's why you have this interest in relational ways of thinking with islands. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, that's kind of my question for sure. And I find it very curious because somehow, for example, the Cyclades, if you look in ancient history, they were always thought as isolated and peripheral. And this is a discourse constructed exactly like for the empires, like the Athenian Empire, to dominate the Cyclades. And lack of natural resources, like island cannot have enough resources to survive, always was a question. But on the other hand, when you think on human relations with nature, if I look to my field, which is ancient religion, there is a kind of a great respect for nature, for the ocean, for the winds, particularly in a region like the Cyclades, where the weather is somehow, even in summer, is can go out of control. So we have altars on the mountains to make offer to Zeus to control the weather, and you pray to Apollo to have a good navigation and cross from east to west, stopping island by island. So there was not this feeling that you could domain the nature, but that you were part of nature and that you had to respect it and even get the grace of the gods. So and this goes against the modern concept of domain of nature.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I'm so interested in learning from people about how islands have been thought about in deeper history that obviously you're concerned with, or deeper history to me anyway. I know archaeologists and historians may think that what you do is relatively contemporary. Time is relative, I guess. But this is true, and I think that the way in which we think about islands have always been these sites of relational entanglements. If you think about Darwin, he discovered, or worked with the idea of life itself as relationally entangled and adaptive, rather than linear in terms of a linear vision of progress, because he works on islands. Now, obviously, he could have discovered that anywhere, but for the argument goes anyway, that it's accentuated with islandness, that mode of thinking. So it would be inevitable as we get more and more interested in relational stuff, that those kind of geographical forms and cultures that you're talking about that have that relational perspective rise up to the surface. When I first started 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, the kinds of island writers like Heofa that wrote about the Pacific and Glisson that wrote about the Caribbean, it's amazing to watch them become so prominent in the broader social sciences and humanities in the last few years. They were always good. They were always good writers. Yeah, it's just us that's changed, and we're interested in that mode of thinking relationally now. We don't like empire so much. There was a waning faith in modern reasoning. So I guess, this must be a perennial question for historians, but how you understand history depends upon the changing nature of what's interesting today as well, surely.
Yeah, no, there is definitely a change, and not that we are not interested just on imperial history, but also how can I say, on the subalterns, classes, and everything. Lillian, do you have any question? Oh, your microphone is mute, Lillian.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, thanks, Professor, for the clarification of the general concept of Anthropocene. You know, it's very important for us who work with classical studies to have you here, because in our area, environmental studies and human interactions with the natural world, as Erika told us, it's a topic just starting to take off. It's important for us to revisit old materials, including ancient Greek religion, as Erika explained, and the mythology to engage the debate in classics, in particularly Mediterranean history and archaeology, you know. So I don't know, we are in the second question, Erika.
Yeah, I guess you can go. Do you have more anything to add, John, about the Anthropocene, or can we go for the second question now?
I mean, I think the only thing I'd add to that is thanks for those kind words, Lillian. I mean, all academics are a bit weird, so that's a good start. And why my weirdness comes from my absolute obsession with the shifting nature of thought. The broader nature of thought. In terms of this shift towards Anthropocene thinking, away from the modern frameworks of reasoning. And perhaps the kind of thing that I do in that regard with my work is really try and bring out that thought develops in the world. So it's not just like the people's heads, they develop ideas about it by thinking with geographies and geographical forms like islands. And islands rise to the surface in international debate, not just because they're symbols of the Anthropocene, you know, of global warming and things, but because they're generative and productive for the new modes of thinking that we're interested in today, like concepts like resilience, for example, which is an adaptive heuristic or analytic, which is obviously not just confined to islands. You know, if my little girl goes to school, she's taught to be a resilient subject. If I'm having a nervous breakdown at university because work's too hard, I'm taught to be resilient, and I go to a class and have resilience learning. And a lot of the earliest research on resilience, and still is today, was done on islands, precisely because, as Darwin told us, islands are these kind of emblematic sites of adaptive relations. So islands are punching above their weight, is my argument, in the broader development of contemporary thought, if that makes sense.
But I wonder if islands always adapt, because, for example, for me, who I studied the cyclades, sometimes we have a very fragile environment, and for example, on the archaic period, we see several settlements being abandoned on the Cyclades because the lack of water. A small change on the amount of water that settlements like in Zagora, in Andros could storage caused the elimination of a quite large settlement, and this is a pattern that is repeated everywhere. So it's not always that islands can resist, and sometimes they also collapse.
Absolutely. I mean, so again, in my work in islands and the Anthropocene, it's the empirical reality of the kind of situations you were just describing is probably, when I say have less interest, I don't mean that negatively. What I mean is, it's just how conceptually, you know, islands become these productive sites to think through with regards to questions of adaptation and resilience, and then broader thinking kind of kicks off from there, or works with islands. And so the empirics is there to be questioned, isn't it? Of course, absolutely. I'm wondering if I could just pick up on Judith Simon's comment here.
Yeah, sure.
Might feed nicely into there. The straight answer to this question, Judith, is absolutely yes. With regard to the Anthropocene Islands book that we were kind of talking about, it's concerned just as much with islandness as the kind of traditional definition of an island surrounded by water. So we look at, for example, where national parks in the middle of Texas, you know, are being developed by thinking with islandness. You know, islands are these localized sites of relational entanglements that enable us to think through island forest dynamics, nature reserves, contemporary approaches to gardening, you know, and so forth. So islandness is a highly productive concept after the waning faith in modern reasoning, because it's the kind of key to the development of more relational approaches to understanding, being and knowing and developing. So I hope that answers your question. And certainly, obviously, you know, islandness would apply to anything today, a city, a car, a snowflake, or people being locked down in the pandemic, because what we're interested in is the relational entanglements of people. And that's why tropes like resilience and other concepts explored in the book develop in that way.
Great. So I guess, Lilian, we can go for the second question, maybe.
The second, yeah. So why did islands become so important for the contemporary debate, particularly on the Anthropocene studies?
So I guess we've kind of already explored some of this, but basically islands, and I guess we're talking here about the traditional definition of islands, separate from the mainland, were kind of the liminal or transgressive kind of spaces where relational entanglements came to the fore of modernity. Yeah. So in Darwin or Margaret Mead in anthropology, or even in Robinson Crusoe and the foundations of Western disciplines like biology and anthropology and so forth, islands have always been these sites of relational entanglements. But as we discussed, in modern frameworks of reasoning, they weren't interested in that. You know, if you think about Robinson Crusoe, he just wants to dominate the island and survive on it. Yeah. So he's a modern man. Yeah. But I think it's a mistake to think of islands as kind of blank spaces in the Western imaginary. They're not blank spaces. They've often been understood as these sites of complex relational entanglements, and therefore these kind of, in the past they were kind of spaces of control. But in the Anthropocene, where these relational entanglements or an interest in human, non-human relational entanglements come to the fore, as I said, the island kind of becomes more interesting, and an interest in islandness becomes more interesting because it kind of seems to do that work. So it would be inevitable, as I say, that things like islands and islandness would become interesting. And yeah, I think that's all I want to say on that, really.
Yeah, I find it interesting the concept of island as blank concepts, because when I look at the Cyclades from the Bronze Age to the Byzantine period, they were conceived as blank spaces, as spaces of a transition from east to the west, and as a space that could be subjected to domain to different empires.
I mean, I think that's right, but it's just weird when you actually think about it. I mean, there is a formula for writing a lot of academic papers about islands. You know, they were blank spaces. Look at the critical reality; they're actually relationally entangled. Well, yeah, okay, that's true, but why would it be that the author or the writer have suddenly realised they're relationally entangled? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not all that clever. You know, there's something deeper in the human imaginary, in the Western human imaginary anyway, goes through to Darwin and that, where islands have always been these sites of relational entanglements. Perhaps the difference was that in the past, we didn't care about that. Mm-hmm. We just wanted to control and dominate nature, and islands were just these things that you think about plantations in the Caribbean, they were there just to be dominated, and islands to be dominated. Whereas now we're interested in digging up those deeper histories of islands being relationally entangled and the indigenous islanders' relational approaches, because that's also what now interests our concerns in the Anthropocene, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I think that's that shift. I've never been comfortable with this idea of islands being blank spaces for the projection of meaning, because I don't think anything is literally a blank space for the projection of meaning. Islands exist in history and in the imagination, and certain aspects of them rise to the fore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm also not comfortable with these concepts. And actually, by now visiting and staying in some very small islands on the Cyclades, I could not only study the archaeology of these islands, but see how much these environment, these places are entangled with other places, and how they can survive, and also how the concept of isolated and weak, it's us who created these concepts, because they have what they needed to survive, sometimes in a very different way. And I have wonderful stories that one day I may even write, because by passing some small islands, for example, one in Cygnus has 100 inhabitants only. It's such a different universe, and I had to adapt me to think on different ways also, because the way that they relate to several things, the way that they function is very different of
Well,
what.
that's the truth, isn't it? I mean, you know, islanders, you know, you were talking about. I mean, for many islanders, they've always been concerned with complex relational movements. Yeah, you know, always. It's just perhaps the academic that's now bringing that to the fore. You know, like I was saying earlier on, the great, you know, people like Derek Walcott, who won the Nobel Prize for History, you know, for literature, for his poetry, or Camus Brathwaite from Barbados, right? You know, he writing in the 50s and 60s. These writers that were on the periphery are becoming more and more central, and we need to ask ourselves why that would be. They've not suddenly got better, yeah. It's just that our interests are shifting, and I believe that's more generally why an interest in Ireland and the conceptual work that islandness does has become so profound, particularly in Anthropocene thinking, because it plugs into and works with the core things that Anthropocene thinking is interested in, if that makes sense. And you know, a lot of this, you know, Anthropocene thinking for me is an islandness thinking, a lot of it. I don't have any problem with making that kind of bold point, I guess. You know, I feel happy with saying it, you know, after writing this book anyway. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say on that one.
Okay. So I guess that then we can go for the third question. Lillian, would you like to? Oh, Lillian, your microphone is mute.
Again, sorry. Thanks a lot for this explanation. And why are islands more appropriated to the study of the Anthropocene than other geographical forms, such as valleys, mountains, and deserts? What makes islands different from mainland areas in terms of studies of the Anthropocene?
So I guess we've been touching on this, you know, the productive power of islandness, but perhaps another way to kind of answer that is to pick up on something I said a second ago, which is, and it picks up on this question of, you know, for people locked down in the pandemic, for example, how about we just imagine that everything's an island in the Anthropocene, yeah, conceptually, whether it's a snowflake, a city, a car, or a real island, yeah, or a human being, or whatever, yeah, because what we're interested in is how things are relationally entangled with other things, yeah, that's what we're interested in, yeah, that's why, you know, the kind of many of the dominant modes of thinking emerge today, yeah. Like we were just talking resilience, for example, yeah? Resilience builds upon, the resilient subject is the subject that's relationally entangled with other things, whether it's a resilient snowflake, a resilient city, a resilient car, a resilient child, or a resilient person that's sent to resilient studies to become resilient, yeah? So if everything's kind of an island in the Anthropocene, what Anthropocene thinking then does is it's concerned with the generative power of, conceptually speaking, thinking with islandness. Now, everything is relationally entangled with everything else. Yeah. So islandness becomes this kind of generator, yeah, for thinking in the Anthropocene, for developing thought, for developing ways of knowing. If we just take another example, islands are often called the canary in the coal mine. Yeah. So if you think about the idea that the Maldives is the canary in the coal mine for global warming, yeah, or they're the front line of planetary change. You know, these islands that are suffering from global warming and intensified hurricanes are a signal of what's to come, yeah. But that's also a mode of logic which we could call sensing or correlation, yeah. It's a shift of thought in which what humans become interested in is constantly sensing and ways of reading relations, shifting relations, yeah? So that's why the island becomes the canary in the coal mine, because we are all interested in constantly sensing and reading relations, whether that's through tracking evolutionary pathways of an island species, or whether it's through setting up digital sensing devices, yeah? The smart city, the smart islands, the smart island technologies. So that feeds into the kind of tropes that become ways of governing and thinking about what it means to govern relations in a more contemporary era. So I think the answer is, it's, for me, the question is not so much that what can others learn from islands, it's perhaps that we're all perhaps islands. There's a famous philosopher called Jacques Derrida who said there are only islands after the end of the world. What that means is there are only islands after the end of the world of modern reasoning. And we are now in that world where everything is kind of, an island, and we're adapting and adjusting and being resilient constantly to shifting, changing relations, sensing, correlating, and so forth. So hopefully that gives some answer to that.
Yeah, that gives. And I have personally, I have to tell that I like this concept of entangled relations, because when I started to study islands, I was very much worried with networks, which is still important, but networks is more is narrow. Is a narrow concept. It doesn't encompass everything and exclude the natures. And I'm actually reformulating many things that I thought, and also including nature on the ancient studies, and not. I think that, yeah, it's a really good concept to think islands and
well,
a more inclusive.
Right. I mean, I think it's all just whether it's networks or an interest in post-humanism, or adaptive relations or whatever. It's all kind of these different funky ways to think about, interrelations, yeah, and the shifting complex nature of life today. I mean, I just wonder whether as historians, do you find sometimes that you read the present back into the past? Life is just chaotic and complex at the moment, yeah? Mm-hmm. And so therefore we're developing ways of governing and thinking about life that are in that way, because the tropes of complexity and entanglement come to the surface. But it must be really difficult for a historian who's kind of overwhelmed by that feeling, probably of the contemporary era, to then go back and study some Greek islands, in Homer's time or something, and not project that back into that. It's a real childlike question, but I'm just wondering how you avoid that.
To project our concepts in the past. Well, I guess it is impossible, and that's why as a historian and as archaeologist, I mean, and that's why you can rethink the same site, even if it's, of course, as an archaeologist, we have a practical aspect, because we dig, we need to organize, we need to study. Otherwise, you can't even start. When you get a vase from the floor, you need to give a date, you need to organize. But after that, you can rethink your sites. And for example, lately, I am particularly concerned to rethink Delos, because Delos is a very small island on the Cyclades where many empires were controlling. And I guess that the question of Delos and its natural resources and the control of these natural resources is something that didn't come so much in question, but because the people were so worried with in Athenian empires and the Naxians and the Parians controlling the islands that they forgot that yes, people, the Cyclades is a semi-arid has a semi-arid climate, and Delos, because of its rock formation, can storage quite a lot of water, so and people can pass there, and that's why a big sanctuary could flourish there. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, it must be fascinating. I mean, I was reading something a while ago, and I've forgotten what it was who wrote it. It was some contemporary theorist, and I wish I could remember because I feel bad about not referencing them. But they were talking about how the Greeks kind of developed boats, and they had to work together, going through island to island across the. And they think that the actual materiality of having to work together so closely, constantly, may have played some role in the generations of forms of politics that emerged. It shifted and shaped the forms of politics. I don't know. Does that make sense to you? I mean, would that be something that could? Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. No. It's interesting, and I guess the Phoenicians. Their movements seem to be incredibly diverse and archipelagic. I know they kind of get raided in more contemporary work as an illustration of kind of how islands are actually often networks and archipelagos rather than fixed spaces.
Yeah. Oh, even the concept of archipelagos is very fluid. I mean, I think
definitely.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that answers that question a bit.
Yeah. So I guess now we can pass to the question number 4. So Lilian, do you want to make that question?
Yes. Number 4. Your book investigates how Ireland went from being historically imagined as isolated and backwards to a forefront position on the Anthropocene. Can you please comment further on this movement?
Yes, I think I can. So I'm just trying to riff on the kind of concerns that you've been bringing up, both of you, so far. And one of these tropes that seems to crop up for archaeologists, but you can correct me because obviously I'm not an archaeologist, is questions of isolation versus networks and relations. Is that correct? So I saw a bit of that kicking off in some archaeology discussion. I think it was on Facebook or something. And my approach to this is, what do we mean by isolation? And this is getting around to why islands are important and prominent in the Anthropocene. Yeah. So what is isolation? Is it the opposite of relations and movements or not? I don't think it's the opposite. And I think where people get their heads in a bit of a mess is when they think of things in terms of isolated versus related, relational or archipelagic or whatever. Nothing is literally devoid of relations. Not even a black hole is devoid of relations. Everything is relationally connected. That's just a reality. That's what's the important thing to perhaps think about. If you think about going back to, like, say, Darwin, and his work in the Galapagos, or Margaret Mead, her foundational work in anthropology on islands, or even kind of more contemporary work, which we've just been talking about, island networks and relations. It's that, just an example, you were just talking about Delos. Islands are kind of localized spaces for the coming togethers of relation. Yeah. So they're not isolated in a kind of conceptual, literal sense. Nothing is devoid of relation. It's just not. Yeah. You know, in fact, islands are in the Western imaginary at the moment actually the opposite. They are the exemplars or exemplary sites of relational entanglements. Yeah, they are the exemplary sites of how a coal power station in North America can screw up what goes on an island in the middle of the Pacific. There is no, particularly in the Anthropocene, there is no way. You can't get away from global warming because we're all already in it. Yeah, you can't get away from nuclear fallout because it's already transforming the planet. Yeah, that's what the Anthropocene is. It's a shift in the whole nature of planetary change. Yeah, so islands are never isolated. They never were isolated. They were always. The evolution of a species on the Galapagos was a product of relations that just so happened to be clearly amplified for Darwin when he looked at how species adapt and evolve. But those relations spanned, you know, a long, long way, just as you were talking about the Delos or whatever. Why islands become interesting in the Anthropocene is because they really do amplify or show that everything's relational entanglement. Yeah, even that small island in the middle of the Pacific, well, obviously it's not a small island that's away to the Pacific Islander, you know, it's there, it's where they are. But for the Western person living in Chicago or whatever, that island becomes an example, a clear example of how everything is relationally entangled. So that's why working with islands, yeah, becomes so interesting, because they really show us how everything's relationally entangled. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, you know, whether it leads to the kind of fetishization of indigenous islanders and how we should all think like them now or whatever, is perhaps a different question. I'm just describing a shift in thought that seems to increasingly privilege islands in a kind of literal, real sense of islands surrounded by water, but also, as we've been talking about, thinking with islandness more generally conceptually. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, makes sense. No, I was just thinking on something curious, because you were saying that our mentality is changing, and because of this we are having more interest on island, and something very curious that is happening now in our area of classical archaeology and history. Although archaeologists were always digging on islands and so, but now suddenly made a click, and some people, they said, oh my God, we are always studying Athens and the Peloponnese, and we know very few about islands. I mean, we have a few general books. Of course, the specialists, they were always there, but now there is a, how can I say, a concern to bring islands for the general public of classics, because let's say the islands were marginalized, and you know, in some ways, because if you think on Delos, most of the literature on Delos is still either in Greek or French, so the very general public, particularly students, it's not so accessible to them. So.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I found it interesting that islands would be marginalized in those.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, on the classical studies, it's not that there are not people studying. You have, for example, the French. They excavate Delos. They published a lot of studies and things. But let's say that as a topic for the general student, it's just that, for example, any book for the first year of art history or archaeology, you will find kind of a large chapters on Athens or Delphi, and maybe nothing on Delos.
Okay. I've always thought that it'd be great to write a book, one must exist, on the islands of the Greek myths. I don't know if islandness in the Greek myths. You know, what role does the island play in the Greek myths? I don't know if anyone's listening, maybe they could write
I
that.
guess that there are quite some papers on this. Yes.
Yeah, cool. Oh, we'll have to send it to those. I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, I can send this. There are quite a lot of. And I guess that on our dossier, Professor Yannis Petropoulos, he's writing exactly about this, right?
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to learn more about that. That sounds brilliant. And I'm just seeing here that someone's just asked a question. Is the concept of islandness and networks always utopian? Can it be applied to a scenario where subjects are in conflict? For example, looking at the pandemic, humans are under attack by viruses. So I'm assuming that the implication there is that islandness and networks is kind of a bit of an idealistic kind of way of thinking about things. Is maybe you could just kind of, have I got you right there? Yeah, that the islandness and networks is kind of a utopian, idealistic way of thinking about things. So how would I answer that? Well, I guess it's what the stakes of your own research are. So as I say, the stakes of my research are to track shifts in thinking, and in particular Anthropocene thinking, and to track how islandness becomes kind of does work for the generation of Anthropocene thinking. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. I'm not normative. I don't necessarily say this is good or bad. I'm just tracking that movement, as it were. Is it idealistic and utopian? I think I had an interview a couple of days ago, and it wasn't quite the same as this, but it kind of came up. I don't know what I think utopian is. It's where we are. Yeah, we are in the world. Yeah, so the ways of thinking about possibilities, like utopianness or idealism or whatever, emerge from where we are. Yeah, so you know, Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, yeah, is really interesting. It's a great text, but it would be weird to write that in the way it was written then today. Yeah, as a political project, it's interesting, but it came from a moment in history, and so the possibilities of politics came from a moment in history. The possibilities of politics at the moment are not that. Yeah, it'd be pointless running up to Buckingham Palace and, you know, shouting revolution, because you wouldn't have anyone behind you necessarily agreeing. Yeah, or you wouldn't have many, and there wouldn't be a movement. So where islandness and networks and concepts like resilience and constant adaptation to change come from, is because that's what we think it means to be human at the moment. At the moment, we adapt, we adjust, we become resilient, we move through our networks, we network, yeah? And those are the tropes that govern our lives and shape our lives, because that's what we think it means to be human today. To constantly adapt, to adjust, to move on, to see the angles, to bounce back from a crisis, and so on. So we become interested in Darwinian's notions of adaptation and things like that, and resilience and islandness. And so the historical possibilities of this moment emerge from what we think it means to be human at this moment. At another moment in history, we may think with islands differently, or we may just think differently, and therefore other possibilities arise. So that isn't me avoiding the question. It's me just saying that whatever's possible at any moment has to come from society and what people think is possible and what is not. And at the moment, in my experience, what we think is possible is how can we adapt and adjust to the virus. Yeah, there isn't, for example, a complete lockdown until the virus is gone, because humans wouldn't accept that at the moment. We're too adaptive and adjustive and so on. So it's a roundabout way of answering that question, but it's an honest answer for me, which is that what is possible only emerges from the society at that time, if that makes sense.
Thank you, John. I guess now we can go for our question number 5. Can you just make a kind of give to us a short overview about your book?
Yeah. So I say it will be a short one. So as we've kind of already been talking about, the Anthropocene Islands Entangled World book, which I wrote with David Chandler, which is just free to download. We really wanted to make it free so anyone can download it. It's to kind of conceptually clarify and draw out, for I think what's the first time in the literature, what we see is this kind of key shift to working with islands and islandness in a broader range of contemporary Anthropocene thinking. So clearly, the interest in islandness and islands isn't kind of one homogeneous turn. It's not like islands are being engaged in exactly the same way by everyone in Anthropocene thinking. They're being engaged in a whole broad range of ways. And what we do in the book is we draw out how islands are being engaged for the development of different ways of thinking about being in the Anthropocene, so what it means to be, to relational ontologies, and also what it means to know in the Anthropocene relational epistemologies. So in the first half of the book, we talk about concepts like resilience, and I was talking earlier with Erica about patchworks, which are different ways in which islands and islandness are being engaged to think about being and relational ways of knowing in the Anthropocene. Resilience has these kind of more modern legacies, and patchworks kind of increasingly loses those modern legacies. And I won't go into it in detail here, but and in the second half of the book, we have another two analytics that we call correlation and storiation. And again, there's this shift from kind of the modern legacies of correlation towards the less modern legacies of storiation. But in short, all we're really trying to do is start a conversation in this book about the various ways in which islands and islandness are being drawn upon for the questioning of modern frameworks of reasoning in Anthropocene thinking, and for the development of alternative ways of thinking about being and knowing, quite profound different ways from what modern frameworks of reasoning is. And to restate what I said earlier, because I think this is absolutely key, the Anthropocene and contemporary thought doesn't exist in people's heads. Yeah, you don't develop how you think about the world without thinking about the world. And as I'm a geographer, but it would be inevitable we'd be interested in certain geographies more than others to develop our more contemporary thought. And it just so happens that we have, whether it's international policy making processes or critical theorists or artists or poets all writing on the Anthropocene, islands and islandness has shifted from the periphery to more to the center of these kind of discussions. For the challenging of modern frameworks of reasoning. But as I say, the book's just a kind of a start, and it was the point of it was also to kick off a wider network where we've got a bunch of lots of people are now involved in that, and maybe we can talk about that later. But it's all about how islandness and islands become generative and productive for the questioning of modern reasoning and for the development of kind of non-modern, more relational approaches to understanding being and knowing.
Oh, fantastic. It's an amazing project. And as I told you before, it took me years to think in my group of islands as a patchwork. And when I finally could see this, I could understand the relations, because it's not one relation, it's so multiple relations, and you can't classify everything. And I collected all the material to study the religion on the ancient cycles, and then I couldn't arrange this, because I guess that I was thinking with such a linear frame, and this didn't work, because I put this group here, but this one couldn't fit, and always something different. And when I got the cycles by what they are, a patchwork, then everything
I think that's great to know. And but also I mean, it does seem to be that maybe I'll say a little bit about what patchworks is, because I know we haven't got much time, but it does seem that historians in particular have taken interest in that, and I do wonder whether it's because we do draw upon some older histories in that one as well. But the patchwork approach kind of challenges the kind of, or moves away from the kind of Darwinian understanding of islands, of adaptive sites that feed into resilience thinking, into a kind of more open kind of spatial ontology of spatial and temporal becoming. So it's much less solutionist than, say, a resilience ontology, which is about how the island kind of exists, and also how people can learn from islands resilience, and then, how we can all learn from islanders and islands resilience. And the patchwork approach is a kind of this much more open, fluid kind of, it's not really networked, is it? It's kind of this open dynamic process of becoming. And there's a great scholar called Tia Weah, which she talks about how we can think about islanding as a verb to come through these processes, ongoing processes. And I think that's something that a lot of historians are now kind of reading back into some of the stuff that they've been doing. So that's really interesting to know. And interestingly, there is actually some I don't want to kind of talk about their work wrongly. So I do apologise if I'm talking about it wrong, but Maggie Henry, who's been involved with the Anthropocene Islands Network, is actually making a patchwork and thinking about islands and islandness, and actually producing a patchwork approach of relations, but physically actually producing a patchwork. And I'm really, really excited to see what she produces there.
I would be very interested too, because yeah, it is indeed a fascinating concept, but yeah, it was really interesting. How can I say? I'm still amazed at how that really took me so long to arrive to this concept. And there are many people studying the cycles. We have about 25 islands that were inhabited, and about more than 120 islands that in total, if you counted the non-inhabited islands. And no, I mean, but people always study either this island or that island, or Paros and Naxos, or Paros and Naxos and Delos, but because it is really a challenge to study this universe together. And and I don't think that would be possible without the new conceptual frameworks, because it's not only a matter of reunite archaeological materials. It's, as you told from the beginning, the problem is to think with another frames and with other problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I think it's I mean, I guess getting towards the end of this now. I mean, I just think that it's never been a more exciting time to work in island studies, and that's not just because of the interesting empirical work that gets done, by archaeologists, anthropologists, critical Black studies scholarship is really, I think, being invigorated by a lot of, for example, Caribbean writers again at the moment. It's that the islandness conceptually seems to kind of plug into the contemporary concerns we have. Like we were saying, with Derrida, there are only islands after the end of the world. And I think that's really quite a profound point to make, that once man, usually a white man that looked like me, is kind of rightly challenged, for this kind of human nature. It wasn't human nature, it was white man controlling nature. Once that's being really picked apart and challenged, these relational approaches and networks and island approaches start to become increasingly to the fore. And you can explore and play that through so many different fields and so many different disciplines. And I think this, we were talking about patchworks or resilience or the other different analytical frameworks. There's some great work being done by people like Phil Hayward in Australia he came up with the idea of the archipelago. There's all these really exciting debates that are taking place around thinking through islandness and island related work. And I just think it's a great time to be involved with it all.
Indeed. Thank you. So I guess that we can go to our last question. Lillian, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, 1 second. So how are you going forward with the critical agenda for the island studies in the Anthropocene?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So what we're trying to do, the book kind of, as I say, was just a kind of a start to try and get people to think about the way in which thinking with islands and islandness has become more important to the generation of, I guess, not just Anthropocene thinking, but critical thought, contemporary critical thought more generally. You know, how we think about and engage relational ways of thinking about being and knowing just more generally, and how it becomes productive in that. And practically, which is to your question, we've got this Anthropocene Islands network, which if you go to the, I've just seen you put the link up on the board there, that takes you to the book, but you can just click in the network more generally, Anthropocene Islands .online, and we've got a lot of stuff going there. So we've got a monthly reading group where we discuss what we think about some key works that are thinking with islands and islandness and relational entanglements that are feeding out and shaping broader thoughts. So as a monthly reading group, we've got a monthly early career group. Early career is defined very loosely, but we decided to keep that because as a title, because we really wanted to generate that more safe space where early career scholars can just come and talk, and you know, no one's judged, you know, it's just testing your ideas out. So we've got the monthly reading group, the monthly early career group. We have a ongoing section of island studies journal called Anthropocene Islands, where people can submit papers around the kinds of themes we've been talking about. And we have ongoing sessions at islands conferences, obviously, and conferences more generally. And there's going to be a theme session called Anthropocene Islands at the Islands of the World conference, which was one of the major islands conferences run by CISA in Croatia in June this next 2022, if people are interested. That's going to be in Zadar. That's going to be a really great conference. They're always so much fun. You know, really.
Is it still open for call for papers?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. You know, I think that's going to be a great place to go, Zadar, in June, because all the islands people, or a lot of the islands people, will go there, and we'll be running a lot of Anthropocene Island sessions. So you can just email me if you want to get involved. But yeah, in short, it's kind of just trying to create these spaces for people of all, you know, stages and backgrounds to just talk about how islands and islandness becomes kind of implicated and engaged for this kind of critique of older modern reasoning and the development of these kind of more relational approaches, you know, whether that's networks or we want to call them patchworks or resilience or all the different things, you know.
Wonderful. John, thank you very much for all these insights and all this talk of island. I think that we don't have more questions here on the chat. I don't see more nothing. I really loved the interview, and I want to make a quite informal question actually. Can you speak a little bit more about this monthly group? Anyone can participate, and the people read it in advance the text, or you just reunite and discuss? How does it work?
Absolutely. So actually, the next one is Thursday. So we meet we hold it at different times in the day, and it's the last Thursday of every month for the reading group and for the early career group. So the reading group is on, this is all London time. So it's on at 10 a.m. London time and 5 p.m. London time. And the early career group follows on immediately after that at 6 p.m. London time. And anyone can join. You know, if you go to the Anthropocene Islands .online, just type in and do a Google search for Anthropocene Islands, yeah, and it'll likely come up. And you know, you can email me to join the emailing list if you're interested or whatever. And we're discussing, I've got it here, yeah. We're discussing this book, which is a really great text called Relational Undercurrents by Michelle Stevens and Tatiana Flores. It's a beautifully composed book.
Amazing.
On islandness and relationalities. It's brilliant. And each month we discuss a different book, and it's a lovely chilled vibe. It's not, you know.
Do you think that we can join? Even I have no idea about this book, but that's
just well, the introduction. Michelle and Tatiana kindly emailed me the introduction, so you can just download the introduction from the web page, and then you'll see the Zoom link, and you just choose which time slot you want to. You can go to more than one time slot if you want, and you just tune in and join in the discussion. You know.
Amazing, great. Lillian, do you have any question?
No, I have. I would like to thank Professor. I learned a lot with you and with Erica because I am starting this field on islands studies, so as we have no further questions, I would like to invite you to visit the dossier Questions of Insularity in the Ancient Mediterranean, which will be launched in December this year. The interview will be available online on the channel and will be transcribed in the dossier of Mare Nostrum journal. So we can, Erica, we can finish the interview.
Yeah, we can finish, and we will send you the link for all the papers, including this paper on mythology. There are other papers also, and I hope that you enjoy some of them. Yeah, and there will be your interview also. Yeah, it was really great. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed that very much. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
So,
So now what, Gabrielle will enter to say goodbye, or?